Content warning. This podcast addresses themes of rape, murder, and slavery in Homer's Odyssey and connects those themes to true crime. While I avoid any graphic descriptions, please be advised that these themes are addressed. Sometimes in grad school, it can feel like courses and assignments are pulling you away from your real area of interest. But sometimes, oftentimes in my experience, they pull you in new directions that provide unexpected insights. And such is the case with this little project, Recovering Bad Women. Welcome to Project PhD Cast. I am your host and grad student, Allison Innes. Recovering Bad Women is a little mini project, a multi-part project that includes a creative podcast, some class presentation, and an academic paper for my PhD course on feminist theories. This particular episode you're listening to now is an exploration or an explanation of my creative podcast episode. And that should be in your podcast feed right ahead of this one. So if you haven't listened to it, you can go back now so you can experience it without spoilers. Because in this episode, I'm going to be connecting that creative sound piece to feminist theories and my work on true crime podcasts. And as you know by now, as a good academic, I always cite my sources, and you can find those in the show notes. Thought of this project, I wanted to explore how women's voices appear in stories where women don't actually speak. How might women's voices appear through sound cues? I began by thinking about the sounds of everyday life that reflect or reveal the activities and actions I perform. I had initially thought about giving sound to women's invisible and often unremarked and unrecognized labor that keeps familial and social systems functioning. But the project evolved in a slightly different direction into considering the covering and uncovering or recovering of women's voices in both a literal biological sense of voice, sound vibrations created by a human body, and a sociological or metaphorical sense of voice, women's stories told by women from their own perspective. Just a little footnote here that my use of the word biological here and throughout is intended to modify the word voice rather than the word woman. My podcast experience began with classics when my partner Darren Sundstrom and I co-created our podcast Myth Take. I see podcasts as a continuation of the oral human storytelling that has existed for millennia. As humans, we're narrative creatures, and we seek to make sense of our world through stories. Long before our stories were written down, let alone created for movie theaters, they were told orally, and Indigenous cultures across the globe continue to create and share knowledge orally. Given my own academic background in classics, and particularly my interest in Greek mythology, I returned to the Iliad and the Odyssey to think about how women's activities of daily life appear in oral storytelling. Today, most students encounter these famous epics of Western culture through the medium of text and the practice of silent reading. But that's really not how they were intended. Because long before these stories were committed to writing, somewhere around 800 BCE by Greek poets, they circulated as oral stories that were told by bards. They were told spoken in communal settings. Podcasting allows these epics to have a second orality, as a modern and trained storyteller like Jeff Wright, for example, can reinterpret and return these stories to an oral form that resonates with a modern audience. And I encourage you to check out Jeff's podcasts on the Trojan War and the Odyssey and his forthcoming book if you're interested in how he tells those stories. This orality gives voice to the pastiche of poets that we refer to as Homer. But it still doesn't completely uncover or restore women's voices in these narratives. As male-authored texts, studied and interpreted by predominantly male scholars, these epics are told from the male gaze. As Cristina Santos says in her work on fairy tales, they present both a model and a mirror to the society that created them and the society that recreates and retells them. There are women in the Iliad and the Odyssey who speak. Helen, Andromache, Hecuba, Penelope all speak for themselves, but again, it's through the filter of a male author. So how might we recover and recenter the silent women in the background, the enslaved women who feed, bathe, and care for our male heroes? So here I looked more closely at the Odyssey, and in particular, the recently published translation by Emily Wilson. So her translation was published in 2017 at the height of the Me Too movement, and it created a bit of a splash. In various media interviews at the time, Wilson reflected on how her perspective as a feminist scholar offers readers a new way of thinking about power and gender in the epic. And this is particularly evident in her approach towards the enslaved women of Odysseus' household, whom he and Telemachus murder on his return to Ithaca. And that takes place in Book 22 of the Odyssey. So for those unfamiliar with the story, briefly, Odysseus returns home to Ithaca after 10 years fighting the Trojan War and another 10 years of voyage to find that suitors, and if we take the numbers as provided in the Odyssey, over 100 of them, impatient to marry his model wife Penelope, have set up camp in his home. They're eating his food, drinking his wine, sleeping with his slave girls. Telemachus, who was a mere baby at best when his father left, is a young man now who has not been able to take control of the household. In his rage, Odysseus slaughters the suitors and orders Telemachus to kill the enslaved women. And as I thought about these passages in connection with our class discussions of Butler, Mulvey, and Traister, I began to see similarities between this text and the podcast I'll be exploring in my research paper called Bad Women. Much like the Whitechapel murders of 1887, also known as the Jack the Ripper murders, that are featured in the podcast by Haley Rubenheld, Bad Women, these women's bodies in Homer's text are made famous for bearing the marks of male violence. They are markers of male power and control, and when that power and control are threatened, they must bear the physical punishment. Now, there are, I will note, a few enslaved women who are not murdered, who represent kind of the ideal slave. My focus is on the enslaved girls who are murdered by Odysseus and Telemachus. And I think their death is a threefold victimology. There's three aspects to how they are treated. So first, they are physically unalived by Telemachus through hanging. This is both a literal silencing of the women and a symbolic silencing. And Wilson points out the symbolic relationship between the mouth and the vagina. With female slaves in particular, there's a close association, she says, between verbal freedom, such as when Melantho insults Odysseus, or the enslaved women laugh and giggle with the suitors, and sexual freedoms. By hanging the women, Telemachus silences their biological voice and ends their identity and utility to the men as sexual objects. And for more on enslaved women in particular, or enslaved people in general, as sexual objects, you can see Wilson 2021 and DuBois 2003 in the footnotes. There's also a connection here to the idea of women's bodies being leaky, I think. Women's bodies are by nature leaky. They bleed, they secrete milk, and leaked fluids such as menstrual blood have been considered unclean or even dangerous to men in various cultures and at various times. So in hanging, the enslaved woman's leakiness and any potential contagion risk is contained. So if Telemachus were to run the girls through with a sword, as Odysseus initially suggests, their bodies would be very leaky and there wouldn't be anybody to clean it up. Homer gives us a lovely scene where the enslaved girls have to clean up after the slaughter of the suitors. Killing and being killed by a sword has coded masculine overtones in Greek mythology as well. And we see this, for example, when Medea kills her children by the sword, she's acting as a masculine hero. So there is the physical unaliving by hanging and the symbolic and literal implications of that. Secondly, the women's sociological voice, their social ontology, is silenced as they're dehumanized by the male author. They don't get backstories. They don't get a sense of individual. They're just kind of furniture in the background of the main action. They lose their identity, furthermore, to the circumstances of their death. Their deaths aren't about them as biological beings, but rather it's their role as objects in the performance of masculine heroics. So as we have explored in our class discussions, women are caught within a triangular web of male honor, shame, and blame. So Telemachus is told several times throughout the Odyssey, including by Nestor and also by his own father, that as the man of the household, he needs to be in control of his household. His attempts to rebuke the suitors or to try to control them are usually unsuccessful. They're kind of running the show. So women, whether enslaved or free, are physical representations of male honor, and the control and enslavement of women is a key part of Greek masculinity, Wilson writes in her 2021 article. As a young man who's bullied and anxious about his status in the household, Telemachus uses the women's bodies as bearers of his rage and frustration. In killing the enslaved women, he establishes his own honor and solidifies his social role as a man. While the killings are sometimes referred to as the execution of the slave girls or as a punishment, Wilson suggests there's wiggle room with this. Both of those terms, execution and punishment, imply rationality and justice. I think the murders, and this is just my perspective, are motivated by rage and shame rather than by some sense of reasoned justice. What have the slave girls done? This has always troubled me. What have they actually done to deserve being murdered? And further, as Wilson also points out, Odysseus doesn't give any indication of there being a just case for execution against the girls. If there's an argument to be made that the women deserve the punishment, and some people might argue that, then I think we have to ask really difficult questions about how much agency the enslaved women actually had. Fawning and freezing are both perfectly valid, human, normal responses to an existential threat, such as that posed by the very powerful suitors. Remember, these are enslaved women, so they're disadvantaged both by their class and by their gender. Are the young women who go giggling with the suitors actually able to say no to them, or are they trying to make the best of their situation? When Melantho insults the disguised Odysseus, is she maneuvering for a better social position within the dynamics of the household? I think the possibility is there. The women are then victimized a third time when their death gets continually reinterpreted in ways that reinforce the male gaze. So in her 2021 article, Wilson provides a linguistic discussion of terms for enslaved people in the Odyssey. And she's also discussed this in interviews in the media. And she reveals how the male scholars have imposed their own meanings on the women through their translation choices. So on a semiotic level, to use some fancy words, the male scholar or translator has the power to both define the sign, so the word choice, and the signifier, the constellation of ideas around that word choice. So the word Wilson translates as slave has been euphemistically translated by male scholars as everything from maids, wicked serving women, servant women, serving maids, faithless maidservants, handmaids, servants, and just plain old serving women. These translations erase the women's identities as enslaved women, who by nature of their status as slaves are marked in Greek society as sexually available, difficult to manage, treacherous, conspiratorial, and a potential threat to freedom. And you can read more about this in DuBois. Their bodies are subject to beatings, torture, rape, whipping, tattooing, and their existence is often seen as a threat to social stability. In their lives as slaves, the enslaved women's agency is questionable at best. As vulnerable, precarious bodies, the enslaved women may choose to sleep with the suitors to curry favor with their potential new master, or they may have no choice in it at all. As enslaved women, they're seen as objects intended for male sexual pleasure and subject to male domination. So the reinterpretation of the enslaved girls as servants or maids suggests a degree of freedom to deny the more powerful suitors than the women actually had. And by choosing those terms, erases a part of the women's identity and story. So those are kind of the academic lines of thought that were informing my podcast creation. The podcast is a creative attempt to encourage listeners to listen for absent voices and to consider whose voices, in either a biological or sociological sense, are not present in a story. And you, as the listener, can tell me how well I did that. As all things exist in relation to other things, this podcast is my reaction, to the current popularity of English language true crime podcasts in North America. I want you as the listener to consider how women's voices are covered over or recovered in true crime accounts And I want those who tell those stories, the podcasters who tell those stories, to consider their role in the shaping and reshaping and the covering and recovering of women's voices. To this end, I made a number of creative decisions. First, I selected passages from the Odyssey that depicted the enslaved women going about their daily lives. I was inspired here by Haley Rubenheld's book, The Five, and the podcast she subsequently made from it, Bad Women, in which she attempts to recenter the murdered women in their own stories and to recover their sociological voices from the historical record. Like Rubenheld, I made the deliberate decision to exclude the description of their murders so that the recovery of their voice is centered on their living bodies. I also know that in making the selections I did, I'm complicit, like Homer, in shaping a narrative about the women for a particular purpose. To further accentuate the male gaze through which we must recover the women's voices, I asked my MythTake co-creator Darren Sundstrom to read the passages from Homer. I wanted them read in a male voice. My own voice is silent. I can only be found through the editorial choices. My decision to incorporate sounds I recorded from my own daily life is a call for the listener to reflect on the absence of voice and the continued policing of women's voices. Although 3,000 years separate me from the enslaved women of the Odyssey, we in the so-called Western world are still under many of the same patriarchal systems. While much has changed, the underlying structures of our Western world today are derived predominantly from Greco-Roman models that privilege male voices over female voices. Women's biological voices are still being policed and dismissed and shut off, sometimes horrifically violently, sometimes publicly or behind closed doors, sometimes casually through the policing of voices as too shrill, too aggressive, too pitchy, too vocal fried, or too angry. Women's ability to speak for themselves is the only power they have, and it's a deeply personal power that comes from within our own bodies. Silencing and diminishing women's biological voices silences and diminishes our social ontology. So the question that my podcast contemplates is if we can ever really recover female voices, let alone a female gaze. In the cases of both Homer and the Whitechapel murders, the women's biological voices are forever silenced. But their sociological voices, their social ontology, can never be fully recovered either. In studying how they have been covered over by the male gaze, we can begin to recover them. But lacking accounts and details from the women themselves, their bodies and their stories will continue to bear the moral meanings imposed on them by the male gaze. Thank you so much for listening to Project PhDcast, an audio research journal created, hosted, and produced by me, Allison Innes. You can, as always, find links and articles in the show notes. Please share your thoughts. Get in touch with me through my website. Learn more about this research project and how you can participate by following the link in the show notes. Music is Grand Dark Waltz by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com and is used under Creative Commons license. You can view this podcast with subtitles on YouTube. Transcripts are available for download by request. Project PhDcast is an ongoing project by Allison Innes, PhD student in Interdisciplinary Humanities at Brock University. This research project has been approved by the Research Ethics Board at Brock University, file number 23020MAURO.